Hi everyone, welcome. This is Silver Rose Moon 43, or Silver, and today we will be reading The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Before I start, a little warning, this book was done about 1910, so there are terms and slang and stuff that we don't find appropriate. Alright, so with that little warning out of the way, I will start with reading. I'm going to start reading the Project Gutenberg portion, and then we will read chapter 1. The Project Gutenberg ebook of the Wendigo. This ebook is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restriction whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away, or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg's license included with this ebook, or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this ebook. The title, The Wendigo. Author, Algernon Blackwood. Release date, January 1st, 2004. Ebook number 10897. Most recently updated December 23rd, 2020. Language, English. Credits, produced by Susan Schell, Beginners Projects, Dave Morgan, and the online distribution proofreading team. The start of the Project Gutenberg ebook, The Wendigo. The Wendigo, Algernon Blackwood, 1910, Chapter 1. A considerable number of hunting parties were out that year without finding so much as a fresh trail, for the moose were uncommonly shy, and the various Nimrods returned to the bosom of their respected families with the best excuses the facts of their imaginations could suggest. Dr. Cathcart among them came back without a trophy, but he brought instead the memory of an experience which he declares was worth all the bull moose that had ever been shot. But then Cathcart of Aberdeen was interested in other things besides moose, among them the varieties of human mind. This particular story, however, found no mention in his book on the collective hallucinations, for the simple reason he so confided once to a fellow colleague that he himself played too immediate a part in it to form a competent judgment of the affair as a whole. Besides himself and his guide Hank Davis, there was young Simpson, his nephew, a D.T. student destined for the wee kirk, then on his first visit to Canadian backwoods, and the later Sky Defago. Joseph Defago was a French Canuck who had strayed from his native province of Quebec years before, and he had got caught in rat partridge when the Canadian Pacific Railroad was a-building. A man who, in addition to his unparalleled knowledge of the woodcraft and bush lore, could also sing the old warrior songs and tell a capital hunting yarn into the bargain. He was deeply susceptible, moreover, to that particular spell which the wilderness lies upon certain lonely natures, and he loved the wild solitudes with a kind of romantic passion that amounts almost to an obsession. The life of the backwoods fascinated him, whence doubtless his surprising efficiency in dealing with their mysteries. On this particular expedition, he was Hank's choice. Hank knew him and swore by him. He also swore at him, just as an old pal might. And since he had a vocabulary of picturesque, if utterly meaningless oaths, and the conversations between the two stalwart and hearty woodsman was often of a rather lively description, this river of explosiveness, however, Hank agreed to dam a little out of respect for his old hunting boss, Dr. Cathcart, whom of course he addressed after the fashion of the country as Doc, and also because he understood that young Simpson was already a bit of a person. He had, however, one objection to Defago, and only one, which was that the French Canadian sometimes attributed what Hank described as the output of a cursed and dismal mind, meaning apparently that he was sometimes a true to type, Latin type, and suffered fits of a kind of silent Monroeness, when nothing could induce him to utter speech. Defago, that is to say, was imaginative and melancholy, and as a rule, it was too long of a spell of civilization that induced the attacks, for a few days of the wilderness inevitably cured them. This then was the party of four that found themselves in camp the last week in October of that shy moose year. Way up in the wilderness north of Rat Park, a forsaken and desolate country, there was also Punk, an Indian, who had accompanied Dr. Cathcart and Hank on their hunting trips in previous years, and who acted as a cook, whose duty was to merely stay in camp, catch fish, and prepare venison steaks and coffee in a few minutes' notice. He dressed in worn-out clothes beseeched to him by former patrons, and except for his coarse black hair and dark skin, he looked in these city garments no more like a real redskin than a stage Negro looks like a real African. For all that, however, Punk had in him still the instincts of his dying race. His taciturn silence and his endurance survived, also his superstition. A party round the blazing fire that night was despondent, for a week had passed without a single sign of a recent moose discovering itself. Defago had sung his song and plunged into his story, but Hank, in bad humor, reminded him so often that he kept messing up the facts so that it was most all nothing but a petered out lie, that the Frenchman had finally subsided into a sulky silence, which nothing seemed likely to break. Dr. Cathcart and his nephew were fairly done after an exhausting day. Punk was washing up the dishes, grunting to himself under the lean-to of branches where he later also slept. No one troubled to stir the lowly dying fire. Overhead, the stars were brilliant in a sky quite wintry, and there was so little wind that ice was already forming stealthily along the shores of the still lake behind them. The silence of the vast listening forest stole forward and enveloped them. Hank broke in suddenly with his nasal voice. "I am in favor of breaking new ground tomorrow, Doc," he observed with energy, looking across at his employer. "We don't stand a dead dingo's chance around here," agreed Sir Cathcart, always a man of few words. "I think the idea's good." "Sure pop is good," Hank resumed with confidence. "Suppose now you and I strike up west, up Garden Lake way for a change. None of us ain't touched that quiet bit of land yet." "I'm with you. And you, Defago, take Mr. Simpson along in the small canoe, skip across the lake, portage over into 50 Island water, and take a good squat down that southern shore. The moose yarded there like hell last summer, and for all we know, they may be doing it again this year just to spite us. Defago, keeping his eyes on the fire, said nothing by way of reply. He was still offended possibly about his interrupted story. No one's been up that way this year, and I'll lay my bottom dollar on that, Hank added with emphasis, as though he had reason for knowing. He looked over at his partner sharply. Better take that little silk tent and stay away a couple of nights, he concluded, as though the matter was definitely settled. For Hank was recognized as the general organizer of the hunt and in charge of the party. It was obvious to anyone that Defago did not jump at the plan, but his silence seemed to convey something more than ordinary disapproval. Across his sensitive dark face there passed a curious expression like a flash of firelight. Not so quickly, however, that the three men had not had time to catch it. He funked for some reason, I thought, Simpson said afterwards in the tent he shared with his uncle. Dr. Cathcart made no immediate reply, although the look had interested him enough at the time for him to make a mental note of it. The expression had caused him a passing uneasiness he could not quite account for at the moment. But Hank, of course, had been the first to notice, and the odd thing was, instead of it becoming explosive or angry at the other's reluctance, he at once began to humor him a bit. But there ain't no shemale reason why no one's been up there this year, he said with a perceptible hush in his tone. Not the reason you mean, anyway. Last year it was the fires that kept folks out. And this year, I guess it just happened so, that's all. His manner was clearly meant to be encouraging. Joseph Defago raised his eyes a moment, then dropped them again. A breath of wind strolled out of the forest and stirred the embers of into a passing blaze. Dr. Cathcart noticed the expression in the guide's face, and again he did not like it. But this time the nature of the look betrayed itself. In those eyes, for an instant, he caught the gleam of a man scared in his very soul. It disquieted him more than he cared to admit. Bad Indians up that way? He asked with a laugh meant to ease matters a little, while Simpson, too sleepy to notice the subtle byplay, moved off to bed with a prestigious yawn. Or anything wrong with that country? He added, when his nephew was out of hearing. Hank met his eyes with something less than his usual frankness. He's just scared, he replied good-humoredly. Scared stiff about some old fairy tale. That's all, ain't it, old pal? He gave Defargo a friendly kick on the moccasin foot that lay nearest the fire. Defago looked up quickly, as from an interrupted ravine, a ravine, however, that had not prevented his seeing all that went on around him. Scared nothing, he answered with a flash of defiance. There's nothing in the bush that gets scared, John Defago, and don't you forget it. The natural energy with which he spoke made it impossible to know whether he told the whole truth or only a part of it. Hank turned towards the doctor. He was just going to add something when he stopped abruptly and looked around. A sound close behind them in the darkness made all three start. It was old Punk, who had moved up from his lean-to while they talked, and now stood there just beyond the circle of the firelight, listening. "Another time, Doc," Hank whispered with a wink, when the gallery 8 stepping down into the stalls. and springing to his feet, slapped the Indian on the back and cried noisily, "Come up to the fire and warm your dirty red skin a bit." He dragged him towards the blaze and threw more wood on it. "That was a mighty good feed you gave us an hour or two back," he continued heartily, as though to set the man's thought on another scent. "And it ain't Christian to let you stand out there freezing your soul to hell while we're all getting a good and toasted." Punk moved in and warmed his feet, smiling darkly at the other's vocabulary, which he only half understood, but saying nothing, and presently Dr. Cathcart, seeing that further conversation was impossible, followed his nephew's example and moved off to the tent, leaving the three men smoking over the now blazing fire. It is not easy to undress in a small tent without waking one's companion, and Cathcart, hardened and warm-blooded as he was in spite of his 50-odd years, did what Hank would have described as considerable in his twilights in the open. He noticed during the process that Punk had meanwhile gone back to his lean-to, and that Hank and Defago were at it hammer and tongs, or rather hammer and anvil, the little French Canadian being the anvil. It was all very like the controversial stage picture of a Western melodrama, the fire lighting up their faces with patches of alternative red and black, Defago in the slouch hat and moccasins in the part of the Badlands villain, Hank open-faced and hatless, with that reckless fling of his shoulders, the honest and deceived hero, and old Punk eavesdropping in the background, supplying the atmosphere of mystery. The doctor smiled as he noticed the details, but at the same time something deep within him, he hardly knew what, shrank a little, as though an almost imperceptible breath of warning had touched the surface of his soul, and was gone again before he could seize it. Probably it was traceable to that scared expression he had seen in the eyes of Defago. Probably, for this hint of fugitive emotion otherwise escaped his usually so keen analysis, Defago, he was vaguely aware, might cause trouble somehow. He was not as steady as a guide as Hank, for instance. Further than that he could not get. He watched the man a moment longer before diving into the stuffy tent where Simpson already slept soundly. Hank, he saw, was swearing like a mad African in a New York nigger saloon, but it was the swearing of affection. The ridiculous oaths flew freely now that the cause of their obstruction was asleep. Presently he put an arm almost tenderly upon his comrade's shoulder, and they moved off together into the shadows, where their tent stood faintly glimmering. Punk, too, a moment later, followed their example and disappeared between his odorous blankets in the opposite direction. Dr. Cathcart then likewise turned in, weariness and sleep still fighting in his mind with an absurd curiosity to know what it was that had scared Defago about the country up 50 Island Waterway, wondering too why Punk's presence had prevented the completion of what Hank had to say. The sleep overtook him. He would know tomorrow. Hank would tell the story while they trudged after the elusive moose. Deep silence fell about the little camp, planted here, planted there, so audaciously in the jaws of the wilderness. The lake gleamed like a sheet of black ice beneath the stars. The cold air pricked, and the draughts of night that poured their silent tide from the depths of the forest with the messages from distant ridges and from lakes just beginning to freeze. There lie already the faint, bleak odors of coming winter. White men, with their dull scent, may never have divided them. The bark and Hardney swamp 100 miles away. Even Hank and Defago, subtly in league with the soul of the woods as they were, would probably have spread their delicate nostrils in vain. But an hour later, when all slept like the dead, old Punk crept from his blankets and went down to the shore of the lake like a shadow, silently, as only Indian blood can move. He raised his head and looked about him. The thick darkness rendered sight of a small anvil, but like the animals, he possessed other senses the dark could not mute. He listened, then sniffed the air. Motionless as a hemlock stem, he stood there. After 5 minutes again he lifted his head and sniffed, and yet once again a tingling of the wonderful nerves that betrayed itself by no outer sign ran through him as he tasted the keen air. Then, merging his figure into the surroundings blackness in a way that only wild men and animals understood, he turned, still moving like a shadow, and went stealthily back to his lean-to and his bed. Soon after he slept. The change of the wind he divided stirred gently the reflection of the stars within the lake, rising among the far ridges of the country beyond 50 Island Water. It came from the direction in which he had stared, and it passed over the sleeping camp with a faint and sighing murmur through the tops of the big trees that was almost too delicate to be audible. With it, down the deserted paths of night, though too faint, too high even for Indian hair-like nerves, there passed a curious thin odor, strangely disquieting, an odor of something that seemed unfamiliar, utterly unknown. The French Canadian and the man of Indian blood each stirred uneasily in his sleep just about this time, though neither of them woke, and the ghost of that unforgettably strange odor passed away and was lost among the leagues of tinderless forest beyond.